Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar, Measuring Learning's True Impact, with David Wentworth, Principal Learning Analyst at Brandon Hall Group. I would like to extend a thank you to SAP Litmos for sponsoring today's webinar. SAP Litmos enables thousands of global companies to deliver training in the now. The solution is comprised of a powerful LMS and a content-rich course catalog that makes it easy to manage the entire learning program from system implementation and integration to ongoing administration. SAP Litmos empowers organizations to align corporate training with the company's most important strategic goals while developing highly upskilled workers who are more engaged, satisfied, and equipped to deliver the best customer experience possible. I wanted to also share a little bit about Brandon Hall Group. Brandon Hall Group is a research and analyst firm that empowers excellence in organizations around the world through our research and tools. Our vision is to inspire a better workplace experience. We have world-class research, data, and expertise across all areas in human capital management. Mark your calendars for the HCM Excellence Conference, February 4th through 6th, 2020. We will host the conference in West Palm Beach, Florida, which blends together market-leading research, analyst insights, and best practices from award-winning corporations. To learn more, visit brandonhall.com/excellenceconference. Currently, we have open surveys in talent risks, employee engagement, talent management technology, and workforce management technology, as well as many others. We would love to hear from you. In exchange, you could receive free research reports and more. To participate, please visit our website, brandonhall.com, and click on Open Surveys. And finally, a few housekeeping items. This presentation is being recorded. The playback will be provided to everyone within 24 hours of the webinar in a follow-up email. If you'd like to ask a question, please do so by typing in the question box for our presenters. If you'd like to download a copy of the presentation instantly, you may find it in the handout section. Now let's turn it over to David so we can get started.
Great, thanks Danny, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining me today. I'm going to leave this up for a moment. I encourage folks to take advantage of that question box since it is going to be just me presenting today. I would love to have some questions and interaction from the group. So if you have any thoughts or questions you'd like to share, use that question box, and that's I'll be keeping an eye on that as I go through so that I can answer your questions or respond to any commentary you might have. So please do that. And also I'll make sure we have a little bit of time at the end for any questions I may have missed or any new ones that might come in. So what we're talking about today, clearly, is learning measurement. So I want to walk through some of the research that we've done in this area around learning measurement, what companies are doing, what they're not doing. And as usual, I'll try to include with that a little bit of what we see as best practices or what high-performing organizations are doing when it comes to measuring learning. And then I have a framework for learning measurement that I want to share, as well as sort of some more practical thoughts on how companies can approach this measurement piece. And so hopefully that generates some interaction between you and I as we go forward. So to get started, we ask organizations, well, what is it? Why are we measuring learning in the first place? What is it that's pushing us to actually do this measurement? And so when we looked at that, we see that there's a lot of different reasons, obviously, and there could be many. Obviously, companies could pick as many as they wanted, but the number one reason is that companies are measuring learning is they want to improve the effectiveness of learning programs. So that sounds like a noble cause, a good outcome to be after. But if we think about that and unpack it a little bit, what does effectiveness really mean? When you say the effectiveness of the learning program, it really depends on what the organization itself defines as effective. So for many organizations that we've talked to and we work with, a lot of the measurement that they're doing, and you'll see this as we go through, is around things like completion rates, right? So, how many people went through it, how many hours people spend in training, and having a high completion rate and a lot of training hours delivered for these organizations is effective learning. And so that's what they're measuring to. Now, for those organizations that consider effective learning, those learning programs that are actually impacting the business and can demonstrate some of those outcomes, that's a different type of measurement altogether. And so what we see is we get into it a little bit and you think about, okay, we're measuring learning to see if it's more linked to organizational performance, well, fewer companies say that they do that. And even fewer are saying that they're measuring learning to see if it's linked or to improve that link between learning and individual performance. So you can see we're getting a little bit further away from what probably the real the outcome of learning should be. And then you see other things like looking for things like learning and employee engagement. I find this one interesting, and I think I'm glad to see it a little bit low on the list. Just trying to determine the ROI of learning programs. I think that's a ghost a lot of organizations have been chasing for years, trying to get that ROI. And when we think in terms of traditional ROI, and we think really in terms of dollars and cents, I think that's what drives a lot of companies to focus so much on training hours and completion rates, because that's very nuts and bolts, black and white number crunching, which is obviously easier to do and easier to line up. But it doesn't really give you the true ROI, which is, are you actually impacting those behaviors and outcomes that you're looking to impact? So just trying to get in there and understand a little bit around what is driving organizations, what's the impetus behind the measurement. And I think that gets at what we're actually measuring and how good we are at measuring it and what we can demonstrate because of it. So we, in our learning strategy study, we asked companies, around some of the challenges that they're facing when it comes to executing on their learning strategy overall. And 69% of companies said that their inability to measure learning's impact, the fact that they can't do that and demonstrate that, that presents a challenge to them actually achieving their outcomes. Because they can't demonstrate whether or not learning is actually having that impact, it's keeping them from focusing on that impact. And so hopefully that's clear. The idea is that if you can't see that learning is having that impact, is influencing outcomes and behavior changes, then you can't adjust, you can't create, you can't build around that to make sure that you're actually doing that. So a lot of it's just happening blind. And this is, again, why organizations default to things like completion rates and smile sheets, because they're just easier to collect, they're easier to gather, people understand what they are, and they'll show that. But it's not helping companies achieve those outcomes. So when you put all this together and we look at things in the whole, we've put together a maturity model for our organizations that we've studied around where they are with learning measurements. Barb actually asked a question before I move on about these statistics that I'm showing. Is it about learning within an organization, or does it also include companies that train external clients? It includes both, because a lot of organizations do both. It isn't all just A or B. Some companies just do external, some companies do just internal. A lot do both. And I think maybe what you're getting at, Barb, we can talk about this too, is the idea that it's often very difficult to, it's hard enough to measure learning across organizational outcomes internally. But there's such a disconnect between the business and external learning audiences and those organizations. So it's even harder. And that is sort of a different story, but we do see that these stats that you're seeing here do include companies that do both, just so you're aware of that. And we can touch on that, like I said, in a little bit. So that maturity model. So, what we're seeing is that, most companies fall into the first couple categories, right? Whether lagging or emerging, where there's some basic measurement going on, not everything's being measured, and there's some basic reports being run, if anything. We see very few companies up at the top levels where they're, gathering data for all different types of metrics and all across a lot of different types of learning, whether it's formal, informal, experiential, or however you want to break that down. And then they can analyze that data using data from around the organization, other parts of the business, so that they can compare and contrast and see what kind of impact they're having on performance. So it's not as though any organizations that feel like they're not doing that, you're not the only ones. Only about 9% of companies that we talk to and work with say that they're or demonstrate that they're at that level. But clearly, when you are, there's a much clearer link between learning and outcomes, and there's a clear line of sight between learning and the business. What's interesting is that when we talk to companies about their learning strategy, only 27% said that their overall learning strategy includes some sort of framework to measure the success of the strategy. So again, learning tends to operate somewhat in a vacuum and somewhat blind in that they don't have the insight into the rest of the business to see what impact they're having. They're not building in a framework to figure out whether or not what they're doing is successful or not. And so it's a big challenge. And, Melody makes a good point here, asking if we think this is related to relatively few industries and or companies in general having a CLO type role. And it can be, although many of the organizations in our studies do have CLOs, or at least somebody that's in charge of learning, right? It might be a VP of learning or director. But yes, if an organization is structured as such and is, let's face it, large enough to have that type of a role, there is a bit more of an inclination to do this type of measurement because that person does have more of a strategic position in the organization. It does have to talk about learning in a much more business-centric way, rather than, say, an organization where learning falls under HR and isn't, specifically segmented out. I don't want to generalize too much. I mean, this is just what we've seen from our research and the companies that we talk to. Clearly, some organizations do it differently than others. There are clearly ones with CLOs that don't do measurement well at all, as well as vice versa. But that does make a good point that it is more likely that if someone is sort of has that accountability, that governance, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but does have that kind of accountability, you're more likely to see this type of measurements in the organization. So what I can't say to you is that, to solve this problem, the best practice is to have a CLO, because that's not something that you can just simply do or not do. But the idea of governance and having people that are accountable for learning's performance in the organization goes a long way. So I appreciate that question. Thank you. So as we move forward through some of the data I'm going to share, and some of you might be familiar with what we call our HYPOs. You'll see that in the data as an acronym, but it's for high performing organizations. And these are companies in our research. When we look at them, we separate them out by companies who report that their key performance indicators, things like revenue, profitability, market share. You can see these up here. Those things are moving positively year over year. And so we take those companies and separate them out from everybody else just to see if they're doing anything differently, thinking differently. In some cases they are, some cases they're not. And so where there is a difference, we like to highlight that. So if you do see hypos on the data as I share this going forward, that's what I'm referring to. So one of the first places we looked at is, okay, so remember back when I mentioned only 27% of companies had a learning, said that they had a framework for measuring success. So now when we look at companies that are high performers versus those that are not, you can see the difference, right? The gap is pretty massive. That among high performers, 40% of them say, yes, we actually do have this framework, whereas everybody else, 18%, say no, say they do. So that's a lot of companies that don't have a framework to measure success in that other category. Now, so all of this stuff from showing hypos and the data is, these are correlations that we found in the data. These are clearly not causations. Anytime I say any of this, I'm not telling you that by having a framework to measure success is going to make your organization a high performer, but rather high performers are far more likely to do this than everybody else. So it's a good idea to pay attention to perhaps what they're doing and how they are thinking. We also asked the companies about, okay, how effective do you believe you are in measuring your learning? Again, this is relatively subjective because we're not defining effectiveness for these companies. We're we're asking them, just do you think that your organization is successful or is effective at measuring, and in this case, formal learning? And the reason why I separated out formal learning to start is because that's sort of the stuff that we've been doing all along, right? This is the courses and the classes, stuff that learning functions should be really good at this point, even as we look to the future and try to wrap our heads around more modern and emerging learning technologies. This is the stuff that we've all been doing for quite a while. And when we ask, okay, how effective do you think you are at measuring it? Even with the formal learning and even among high performers, the numbers aren't stellar. Only 58% of companies, of high-performing companies, say that they're either effective or very effective at measuring formal learning. Far fewer of everyone else says they are. So if we're not even really that good at measuring formal learning, what's going on? You know, there's clearly a challenge here that we need to address and figure out what to do. And then if we say, okay, let's think about more informal learning types, whatever that means for your organization, peer-to-peer, collaborative learning, however you want to define it, but how well can you measure the learning that's going on in those types of environments? And the drop-off is precipitous. You know, barely 21% of high performers are effective at measuring that. 11% of everybody else is able to measure that. Now, and we can discuss this a little bit if you like, and if everybody has these questions on it, please jump in and ask. But from what I'm seeing and what we're seeing as we go through this, the challenge is that our measurement frameworks and ideas and infrastructure is all built upon more traditional learning models. Even though I just showed that we're not very good at that, even that's what everything's built around. The whole reporting structure, the analytics piece, is sort of built around this old version or old vision of learning, this idea that, butts and seats and completions. And so that's what it's built around. So when you get into these different types of learning, you have micro learning and games and simulations and whatever else is happening, all of a sudden organizations like, well, none of this fits in my boxes that I have for measurement. So I can't really measure. I'm not doing a good job of figuring out. I can't tell you how many hours somebody spent doing something because it's not that type of thing. But that's really the point. That's sort of what we're after. And we're saying that if we change the way we think about measurement, if we break out of that traditional mold of measurement, suddenly I don't want to say it becomes easier, but it becomes clearer how we should be measuring learning. Right? If we're focused on the outcomes and the behavior changes and things like that, things that we're after by even creating and delivering learning in the first place, suddenly it becomes less important how the learning is being delivered. And it's really just about what was the state prior to the learning, what's the state after the learning, and what's the difference, and are we moving in the right direction? So it's a pretty interesting idea that we need to really just rethink the way we think about measurement. And like I said, I'm going to go into a framework a little bit that helps walk through that and talk through that. All right, so I do have a poll question, and as I pull this up, I just wanted to find out from the group, and this should pop up for you. Do you do this? Do you measure learning's impact on behavior and or performance outcomes? And you just say never, sometimes, regularly, always. Obviously, the choices are there. Pretty straightforward. We'll give us a few seconds, and in that time, I did have another question come in. So, Melody's asking, do you think any measurement is helpful, or do you have to go all in? And obviously, some measurement is better than none. And in some cases, and I think I actually have this quote later in the presentation, so maybe I'm giving a little away, but more measurement isn't always the answer either. It's more about better measurement. So yeah, I think some measurement is good. When I sit here and I sort of downplay the measurement of completion rates and smile sheets, that isn't to say that don't measure those things, because clearly, A, it's easy to capture, and B, we should measure that stuff, but it doesn't carry a whole lot of value without any other metrics to use it with. If you're analyzing it by itself, it doesn't say much. If you walk up to the CEO of an organization and say, hey, 87% of the people who took this training program finished it, it really tells them nothing. They have no idea if anybody's better, smarter, faster, stronger, anything. So it's really, really critical that, yeah, we measure these things. We should have that, but it's the way you use it, it's the way you analyze it. And to further on Melody's point, do you measure every type of informal learning, or just try to get peer-to-peer hours first and then add on other metrics over time? I think that's probably true. I don't necessarily think you can measure every single bit of informal learning that happens, especially as you branch out into more experiential learning, the type of learning that just happens. The best we can do with that stuff is really hopefully facilitate it, encourage it, make it, make sure that it happens. But the measurement can be difficult. So we can't focus on trying to measure everything. And we'll talk a little bit about Kirkpatrick too, but if you look into the Kirkpatrick model, even they themselves say you don't necessarily have to measure every single program at every single level, simply because it would be almost impossible to do. Okay, so we've got a pretty good response rate on this. I'm going to close that poll and I'll go ahead and share it now. And yeah, what I expected? About 59%, 60% of the base group is sometimes we measure that, and it's understandable. It can be difficult. But I think what we'll see as we get through the presentation is that some of the things that make it difficult are the ways we think about it and the way we go about it. And there are ways to try to get better at it. So clearly, there's rooms for improvement to do a little bit better job of measuring the impact that learning is having. Because in reality, if we can't do that, if we can't demonstrate that the training, the learning, however you want to describe it, whatever you're delivering, isn't changing a behavior, isn't improving performance, then what are we doing? I mean, even from a compliance standpoint, if we're simply trying to go through an exercise to change the box, to check the box, and we're saying, okay, here's your forklift training, take this and complete it. Now I know that everyone who drives a forklift has completed the training. That's not the end of the story. I mean, are we down on the floor? Do we see that there are fewer accidents? Do we see that people are actually operating them properly? Are they not trying to bypass safety features on the machine? Those are behaviors, those are performance outcomes that are far more meaningful than whether or not somebody finished it. Yes, of course, if you get an audit, or if you have to demonstrate to some regulatory body that you're in compliance, the check the box piece is important, but really the ultimate goal is to actually change the behavior. Okay, so I'm going to hide that poll. And before we go on, Melody has a good point too. The concept of informal learning is very subjective. What encompasses informal learning? And again, this is one of these things that we sort of leave up to organizations. We try to give them, in our research, we say things like peer-to-peer collaborative learning, self-directed learning, those types of basically things that happen outside of a formalized e-learning course or a formal classroom. Because even within, say, like a classroom environment, there can be informal, social, collaborative learning going on there as well. So it is very subjective, and we have to leave that open to the interpretation of the organizations that we talk to, because it's slightly different for everyone. But the idea is that stuff that isn't necessarily prescribed directly through maybe a traditional LMS platform or something where it's a class or a course, right? It's more about the different types of experiences that are happening there. So that's what we are referring to anyway. So you all responded about measuring at different levels, and again, so when this says at level 3, so that's what we're talking about. In your organization or you personally might not ascribe to the Kirkpatrick model, and that's fine. The truth is, the model itself is pretty common sense, right? It's the idea of being level 1, measuring, in level 2, the fact that people, reacted to the course, did they like it or not, or the experience, whatever it is, level, and then can they demonstrate that they learned something, right? Can they take an assessment at the end and say, yes, I know this, that, and the other? But once you get past levels 1 and 2, the gap between 2 and 3 is massive, right? This huge leap from you can answer the questions on a test to are you changing your behavior, and can I show that and demonstrate it, which is why it becomes so difficult. But even if you don't call it Kirkpatrick levels 1, 2, 3, 4, even if you don't use that, chances are you still think of it in these same ways. So we ask companies how much of your learning, and again, this goes back to Melody, your point about do we measure everything? We ask companies how much of your programs are measured at level 3, which is that behavior change. You can see for high performers, only 19% say that they don't measure anything at level 3, whereas you look at the other group, and it's 38% say that we don't measure anything at that level. So, and you can just see that high-performing organizations are more likely to measure more programs at these higher levels than everyone else. So you see, but they're not measuring everything. And like I said, even the Kirkpatrick model, the group themselves say you don't necessarily have to measure everything. Clearly, you're going to measure more programs at levels 1 and 2 because they're easier. And just for the group, somebody asked for a quick rundown of the levels were, and just so really quickly, level 1 is the reaction. Did you like it or not, right? Your satisfaction. Level 2, did you understand it, right? So that's an assessment. Can you answer these questions? Level 3 is behavior. Are you using what you learned? Are you applying it? Is your behavior changing? And level 4 is results, right? Are you actually having an impact on outcomes and performance? So, yeah. and Melly, that's the point where you're making. You're echoing. She shared this, that can't imagine that every piece of training content would get measured at level 3, and that's true. It can't. But you're right that we focus on the big ones, the big initiatives, especially if this program that you're thinking about, that you're talking about, was created to address a specific challenge, right? There's a reason why it exists, hopefully. And what is that? What are we trying to accomplish with it? That's the thing you should be measuring, and those are the programs you should be measuring. Correct that you can't think you're going to measure every single job aid or whatever you have at these higher levels. But what we are seeing is that there needs to be more of this higher level measurement than there is today, for sure. So then we ask companies why they're not doing this. So if you're not measuring at levels 3 and 4, why? And the biggest one is we just simply don't have the time or staff, right? So there you have it, right? That's one of the biggest things, and there's really not a whole lot you can do about that. But there isn't. Companies feel they don't have the time or the staff to do that type of measurement. Now, the idea is, again, we have this framework we're going to walk through. Hopefully, this type of thinking can help push in the right direction. That makes it easier to do, given whatever time and staff you do have. We don't have the proper metrics. That's a key one. People don't know what to measure, and again, we'll talk a little bit about that. Don't have the technology to support. That's a big piece. What technology are you using currently to deliver your learning? Doesn't have a robust reporting and analytics feature, and they're getting pretty amazing as every year. They're getting better and better, the tools that are available to measure this stuff and how you can use it. And then you see it's difficult to link the learning to the outcomes. It's just too difficult to assess. But I think the important one too here is that number 4 is that we don't see a need. Only 4% say that, right? So only 4% of companies like, we don't need to measure anything for behaviors or impact. So clearly there's a need to do it. There are some challenges, but none of them are completely insurmountable. And I think we need to try to do better and try to get going. So some of that gets into where are the metrics coming from? So we ask companies, how involved are business leaders in making or determining what those metrics are? Are they involved? And you can see here that among high performers, 26% say that there's no involvement of business leaders in metrics, but 30% of the others say that. So it's close, but still, again, high performers are more likely to have at least some involvement from business leaders. But you can see the difference here where you got 11% of high performers say business leaders are the primary decision maker in what learning metrics are, right? So the business saying, this is what outcomes we need from training and learning. So you can just see a little bit there from the idea of involving the business leaders in the metrics conversation. And then one more poll question. This is the only one. I won't beat you to death with polling, but I think just some of the stuff is interesting to be anyway, to find out where you guys are and what's going on. But I like this one. Let me know, and this is a pretty broad question, but how accurate do you believe the data is in your organization? And I know there's different data from all over different parts of the organization. Just a general sense of what you think is going on in your organization. How do you, especially those of you on the call who are most likely learning professionals, from your perspective as a learning professional, how accurate do you think the data is throughout the rest of your organization? And we'll give that a minute. And I'm going to take a look at the questions here again. And yeah, actually, you have this good point. Employees say they have a hard time putting a number or percentage on their behavior change, like a soft skill training. Yeah, of course. And that might be a little much. I mean, we definitely want that feedback from the learners. We want them to be able to give us feedback on whether or not they feel as though they've changed their behavior. They've put something into practice. Hey, I do this differently now. But they can't be the sole source of that. And like you said, it's hard to put a percentage or a number on that. But perhaps with business leaders and managers who understand what the change is and what needs to happen and can look at it from a different perspective. That's where those numbers come from. So maybe we aren't asking the employees to try to, make that assessment themselves, other than report back in the ways that they can, whether through feedback or if it's part of the performance management process showing that they've changed or gotten better at doing something. But that's a good point to make, Anka. Thank you. Sorry, so then this poll, I'm going to go ahead and close that one. And let's take a look. So, well, you got almost 10%, let's say 9%, there it is. Yeah, say not at all. This is not accurate at all. 43% say it's somewhat accurate. And then a good, decent group there saying that the data is decent. So that's not too bad, but you can see that where it obviously tends to go, right, on a slope, is that there isn't a lot of faith in the data. Only 1% say, our data is near perfect. So you've got a team of, maybe the robots have already taken over and you're in good shape. But what we see all time and time again is that there's a data challenge out there. So when we think about measurement and we talk about all these things and getting data from around the business, there's another challenge. And this comes back to that idea of having business leaders involved in determining metrics. These are part of these upfront conversations that companies need to, or that learning needs to have with other parts of the company, right? So getting involved with businesses to determine what the metrics are, but then getting involved with other parts of the business around data. Right. So what data can we use? What do we have access to? Half the time we talk to learning professionals, they're like, oh, I'd love to be able to measure this against that, but I have zero access to that data. I don't even know where it is. I wouldn't know how to get it. But a bigger challenge is that nobody thinks any of the data that's in the company is really that good. In our research, our respondent pool is heavily learning, right? Heavily tilted towards learning professionals. So clearly there's a little bit of a bias here where more learning professionals think that the learning data is either accurate or highly accurate than everything else. But I'm going to tell you something interesting. When I do cut out learning professionals from the data and look at people who aren't in learning, the breakdown doesn't change very much at all. So then you look and see, as you go out to things like performance management, business intelligence, which by its definition is data. Only what's that? 45% of companies say that, or say that they feel like that data is either accurate or highly accurate. Core HR, 35%. Almost everything that you're doing as a learning professional has to derive some of it from core HR, but there's no faith in the data. And of course, external sources is understandable. We have very little control over that. But so there's a challenge here in that if we're going to start having these conversations with other parts of the business about, well, I want to be able to analyze my data based on this data over here, but there's no faith in the data. So we have the conversations of why do we not have faith in the data? How can these other parts of the business and learning itself demonstrate that their data is accurate? And look, this isn't part of this presentation. It's a whole other thing. But as we talk more and more about machine learning and AI, I mean, that's all based on data. And so if we're in a position where no one thinks the data is any good, we can't start feeding that into algorithms that are just going to churn through it and recognize patterns based on data that isn't accurate. So this is a challenge that companies have to really get their heads around. Let's get into a little bit of like the metrics. So this is where we start to see what high performing companies are doing rather than everyone else. So we look at some basic metrics, things like completion of courses, employee satisfaction surveys, those questionnaires, those sort of things. And there isn't a ton of difference here between high performers and everyone else with what they're using. Like even course grades, not very many, but companies are using it, but it's a pretty equal distribution. But when you think of things like coach or mentor observations, high performers are more likely to do that, more likely to look at managerial observations. So there you start to get into the behaviors, right? That's where those are going to start to surface. The ability to perform a new task, I mean, that's clearly a performance outcome. High performers are more likely to do that. But then we look at things that are maybe not considered specifically metrics, but more outcome based. We see that high performers are way more likely than their counterparts to do these things. So things like employee engagement, team effectiveness, and rate of knowledge transfer. Some of the ones that are in here, the graphic has cut them out every other one, but we'll clear that up in the deck that we send out in the email. But the point of the matter is when it comes to outcomes, like the second one here is individual performance, high performing organizations oftentimes are more than twice as likely to use these outcomes as a measurement of their learning. So the takeaway here is that high performing organizations are much more likely to use outcomes to measure their learning rather than simple metrics, like when compared to other organizations that maybe aren't performing as high. So the goal then is we need to think about outcomes much more. And so let's talk about that in terms of our measurement framework, which really helps organizations think through how to look at this. So there's a lot going on here, and this framework itself, this model, is sometimes an entire day workshop for us. We work with organizations and take an entire day or even 2 days to walk through this and exercises and how to think through this. But this is in the deck. You'll have this for your own reference. But the idea is to start with, learn it from a learning perspective, to start with business performance outcomes. And we've got some pretty generic ones up front here: revenue growth, profit increase, whatever, what you have you. But it's whatever is important to your organization. What are the goals that the business is after? And what's the key here is that a lot of times in learning, the learning function doesn't think of those things first, doesn't look at those things, isn't privy to those, isn't part of those conversations. And so that's why measurement seems to happen after the fact. But instead, it used to happen at the very beginning. Measurement's the first step, right? When we're going to build a program, when we're going to initiate some new learning, we're going to create an academy. Well, okay, that's great. What are you after? What should be happening if you successfully deploy this learning? And then based on what those outcomes are, then we say, okay, what are the learning performance outcomes? What should the individual learners be able to do that affect those business performance outcomes? And very often this is where things like competencies and skills come into play, whether or not your organization has those or is working towards those. Having a system in place that you can define and measure against skills and competencies is a critical part of this, because that's what those outcomes are. Like, in order for our business to perform at this level, we need to have these competencies, and these competencies are made up of these skills. So that's what the learning performance outcomes are after. Can we get people to behave or perform in a different way than they are previously? And then, okay, so what are the learning objectives? What are the outcomes of the learning itself? Not what the learners are going to be able to do, but at the end of the learning interaction, what should a learner know or be able to do or be able to demonstrate that shows that they're going to be able to do and the behaviors or the performance that's required that will influence the outcome. So you see what we're doing? We're working our way down the line. And once we've identified what those learning objectives are, that's where we go more from science to art, right? We're into the learning modality assessment, this idea. And folks might be familiar with the 70-20-10 model, which basically says that 10% of what we learn at work comes from formal places, 20% of what we learn comes from informal experiences, and then the rest, the bulk, 70%, comes from experiential learning by doing, observation, trial and error, that sort of thing. Now, that doesn't mean that every learning program you put together has to go 70-20-10. It's just saying that this is how people tend to learn. So as you're building it, depending on what your outcomes are, depending on who your audience is, depending on the time frame that you're working with, that's when you start to put together your learning construction. How much formal instruction is required for what we're doing? How much informal should we be using? Is there an experiential part to this? And there could be, there might not be. It could be whatever the mix you think is right. But the point is to try to create it in somewhat of an iterative fashion so that you can adjust and adapt and evolve as necessary. Because as you put this thing together and then you implement, that's when you're able to start to measure, and you can start to measure against the learning objectives first, right? To see if, are those things that we identified, are those happening? Because if they're not happening, chances are the outcomes, the learning performance outcomes and the business performance outcomes aren't going to happen either. So you can right away determine that you need to make a change before, you don't have to wait and see if the big outcomes are happening. And then make adjustments as you go on. So the idea is that figure out if you're meeting the outcomes or not, and make changes along the way. But the whole idea is that the outcome of learning isn't learning, right? So the idea that somebody finished a program, that's not the outcome. The outcome of learning should be some sort of behavior that drives performance. And then, companies that do this, having a much better time of it. And again, this middle bit, the putting it together, that's separate from, it's part of this model, but different from measurement. It's about what you're putting together, and it doesn't have to be very linear. It's a blended approach that's going to work. So so Eric, just to clarify, just in case anyone else has the issue, Eric was asking 70, 20, and 10 model. Yes, 70% experiential, that's what I was saying, and 20% informal and 10% formal. That's the model of the 70, 20, 10 that was 20, 30 years ago, that was discovered. What we're showing here in the construction is that you can have any makeup that you want, keeping in mind that that's how people tend to learn. What really matters is what your outcomes are, what you're after, who you're working with, what your audience is, what their time frame is, how you put it together. It could be 100% formal. It could be whatever mix you want it to be. And that's what I think you're looking at here in that construction column. That you can make it up, whatever's going to get you the outcome that you desire. You don't have to build everything to be 70, 20, 10. That's just letting you know that's typically how and where learning happens. Okay, so some of the more practical pieces, let's talk through here, and look at a way forward. So the idea is having a metrics-centered approach, focusing on these metrics, right? So again, starting with these at the outset, what are we after? By having metrics, having these ideas of what the goal is, it allows, you have that clear communication with C-suite so that you can talk about it in terms to understand that we want to do these things for the business. And when you're focused like that, you're setting yourself up for much better analysis in the long run, because you're started with something specific. And then again, good data governance, we talked about that, the faith in the data. If you've got a good data governance model in place, that helps. And so you've got a valid analysis. And if you get good at this, if you're doing this well, it helps with learning prioritization in the future, as well as funding, right? So if you're beyond just saying, oh, well, people completed this or people liked it, if you're able to demonstrate the impact on these metrics, you can use that in budget requests and decisions, which is very important. And then in order to move to those levels 3 and levels 4, you're going to have these metrics in place, or else it's impossible. And that's why a lot of organizations don't. You saw that in our data, where a lot of the companies said the reason they don't do it is they don't have the metrics. They don't know what they're measuring. So when we think about learning and how we're putting it together, there are obviously a lot of different instructional design models out there. These are a couple of the more familiar, a little bit more traditional. I think in that framework that I showed, we're thinking more along the lines of a succession approximation model, more iterative models. But any of these models that you may ascribe to or use, the first step is to analyze, right? Well, what are we analyzing? If you're actually adhering to this process, whether you're doing it in a formalized way or just thinking about creating learning in this way, the first step is we have to analyze. So what are we analyzing? We're analyzing what the goals are. This is where metrics come in. It comes into play right here. It's not an analysis simply of, okay, who are our learners? What kind of equipment do they have, or technology do they have? What are we using? It's also, what are we after? And that has to be, and it's the first part of all of this design process. So it's right there in the instructional design model that we need to think about the outcomes first as we're designing. So and part of that is then, okay, when you have a governance program, right, that's the important part, is having, we talked earlier on about the accountability piece. So having governance, it helps that when you're designing and developing these programs, they're always connected with business KPIs, because you've got this governance model in place, or this structure, or even a group of people that are in place that make sure that as any project begins, it's got some sort of connection, some tie to the business, to KPIs that the business recognizes. And so the question is, what existing KPIs will change and how, right? So there's a place to start, because these things exist. All of these things we're talking about, they're there in the business somewhere. because the business wouldn't operate otherwise. It's a question of making sure that as a learning function, we understand where they are and what they are. And then, even as everything evolves and changes, don't lose track of that focus. So, as you go back and in that model, you come back and it's an iterative process and you're changing things and you're trying to fix things so that, people are more engaged and you can't lose focus of what the outcomes, what those KPIs were that started it in the first place. So more of the questions that you ask yourself in this process: what metrics are available to me? So the business obviously has metrics about how well it's doing. What are available? What are those metrics that the business uses? What are the languages? What's the language that they use? The learning need that you're fixing, is it a direct response to a metric movement? So there's a metric in the business that perhaps has gotten worse, right? Something that's supposed to be going in one direction is now going in another direction. Is that what we're responding to by creating this learning program? Is the goal to either stem that change or to reverse it? Let's determine what is that change that we're after and what's reasonable. What do we think we can actually accomplish through a learning program? And then the person or people who are responsible for the program, can they articulate that? Can they say that if we put this in place and we build it this way, we should be able to make this metric do this, that, or the other, whatever it is that we need for the outcome. So it's really important to think about these things at the very beginning. And that's really all I wanted to drive home with the way forward pieces, to start your learning thought process, your design process. And you see through our model, you see through the framework that I showed, you see through even those instructional design models, metrics are first. Far too often organizations finish with metrics. They build a program, they get asked for training. They say, we need something. The business says, we just need something. They don't provide any insight, no guidance. Learning hasn't been part of the conversation that came to that conclusion that this was needed. So they build it, and then it all rolls out. And then learning says, okay, now let's measure it. Well, measure what? We don't even know where we started. So what are we measuring? And so the measurement becomes, well, people finished it. And so what happens is learning gets very wrapped up in this idea that the mere fact that they created the learning gives it its value. The fact that the learning exists means that it's valuable and that it works and that it will have an impact. So all we have to measure is whether or not people finished it, because if they finish it, then job well done and everything will go as planned, which is not the case. We actually have to be able to measure against something. So that comes first. You got to get involved with the business to define the metrics of success. If you're in an organization where business leaders come to learning and treat the learning function as order takers, there's got to be a way to sort of try to change that conversation, to get involved at some point. Now, you don't have to go and demand that you be in on every strategy meeting for every part of the business, but when the business starts to talk about things where learning, some sort of learning program or training could be a solution to what they're dealing with, they need to bring in the learning function and have that discussion around what's important. So, okay, and Liz asked, well, can you give an example? Right at the top of my head, just really quick, simple, straightforward example would be sales. It could be, okay, sales need to be better. So we need some sales training, and they deliver some sales training, and whatever that sales training is, maybe it's how you sell, maybe it's better product knowledge, whatever it is. And so then training says, learning function says, okay, here's some sales training that we bought from somewhere or that we have, and we roll that out and people take it. Now, well, what's supposed to change? You can see the outcome pretty clearly from sales, whether sales have gone back up or not, right? So there's your metric. You can't just measure that people took the training and say, okay, well, then everybody should be better at sales. No, but even just seeing if the sales go up or down, if they don't go up, if things don't change, well, why? Are people doing what they're supposed to? Maybe you've changed your sales approach. They're using a different philosophy on sales. Are people actually using those, putting that into practice? Are people, demonstrating the behavior change, or not? And that's the key. So when sales comes to the learning function says we need sales training. Okay, about what? What are we trying to change? Is it product knowledge? Do we need people to be able to speak to certain products in a different way? Do they need to be able to compare their products to competitors in a better way? What exactly are we after so that we can measure it? And then the metrics of success, these things that we're talking about, they apply to all types of learning. Any type of learning interaction can be measured in this way, because we're not looking at hours. We're not looking at smiley sheets. We're saying, okay, you went through a simulation, you went to a class, you clicked through an e-learning course. Whatever it is that you went through, are you demonstrating that you are doing things differently, thinking about things differently after having that interaction? And if it's sort of a continuous learning, micro-learning, are you continually doing those things in the future as you're being reinforced and giving opportunities to apply your knowledge? Are these things happening? This applies to any type of learning. Whereas, okay, I can't measure how many people spent how much time in a particular type of informal learning. That's okay, because we're really after something else. And this is what I was talking about earlier, the idea that more measurement is good, but meaningful measurement is better. So yes, you want to measure more things. Some is better than none, but it's more about measuring meaningful things, and that means focusing on performance-based outcomes, things that help the business, and that can be individual, it could be team, it could be business, it could be the organization, whatever it is. But then when we think about the idea of ROI, it's more about what's the impact and not the investment. It's not necessarily dollars and cents. Although, if you are using this type of framework and you're starting with those strategic business conversations about what the training should be doing, those business leaders should be able to help learning articulate the business impact, the ROI, the dollars and cents of what they're doing. And a lot of times what happens is, I hear this all the time from learning professionals, is, well, yeah, we put this in place and things got better, right? Sales went up or whatever, but we can't prove that we are the only one. There's a lot of variables. It's seasonal, and the product changed, and there was this, so we can't say that it was learning. But why wouldn't you? Because yeah, there are a lot of variables, but learning is one of them. So if you have this sort of framework in place and you're following this, you're able to demonstrate what your impact is and say, yes, we are having an impact. Yes, I know there are other factors in play, but we also have an impact. So you can't just abdicate, the fact that you're having an impact by saying, well, there's too many other variables. You have to own your part of that. So it's very important. So with that, I've seen, we got about 10 minutes or so, or I'm sorry, 8 minutes or so. We did have a few questions, so I want to make sure that I get to some of these. And I touched on this earlier, Andrea, about measuring outcomes for external clients. That is a huge challenge. I understand. I hear that a lot. It's really about the relationship you have with those external clients and how deep into that or those organizations you can get, because it's not your organization. You're not going to have the relationships and the insights to the business that you do. Now, in the conversations with those clients about why they're using your services, why you're delivering training to them, you can sort of set that up and be, okay, what are your goals as a client to having this training? What are you hoping happens? And then, okay, is there a way that you could report back to us? We don't need specifics. We don't need to, get into any proprietary information, but is there a way for you to report back on whether those things are happening based on our training? Because if they don't, that's all you're stuck with is, yeah, they bought it and they took it, right? And that's all you have. And so, you might have to use that. But if there's a way to, it's like having the conversations with the internal business, right? Hey, look, can you tell me what it is we're after? And is there a way for you to show me that those things are changing or not changing as a result? But that's really what it's about. Now, how do you measure? It's the same thing, right? It's the same types of measurements. It's just a question of getting access to that, and whatever it is, maybe you're actually able to get data, performance data from people who've taken the training. Like, look, we've got these people, and maybe they anonymize them or whatever, but their abilities or their skill level or their competencies were this. They took the training and now it's that. But you have to have that conversation with them, because they're not invested in what you're doing. Yes, they want your training, but they're not going to come to you and offer it up. You're going to have to make that extra push for sure. Okay, and Liz asks, how about leadership? How do you measure whether or not somebody's a better leader? Well, that's up to the organization. Does your organization define what a good leader is? Do you have a set of leadership competencies that define what you want out of a leader? And okay, you've defined those. What does your organization show as a demonstration of those competencies or skills as a leader? Because that sort of measurement must exist because those people were put into those roles. Those people, exist continually in those roles. They have some sort of performance review, I hope, in those roles. So how are they being measured day to day? And so the idea is, okay, are we able to make them better at that by putting them through these programs? And that's stuff like 360 reviews. Other leaders, do they recognize their leadership qualities? Do their subordinates, or however you want to call it, do they report back that this person's a good leader? Whatever they're leading, what are the business or performance outcomes of that group, that geography, whatever that are, those getting better because that person is the leader now? So again, those things should be in place. It's a question of connecting them to the learning. So it is a challenge, but leadership is a big piece, and it's a little bit more complex. But again, the idea is that these things should exist, they should be in place, and that's how we're measuring it. Any experience with measuring outcomes of mentoring programs? Well, I don't have specific experience, although what I'm saying, you saw in our data here that high performance organizations are more likely to use coach and mentor feedback as a measurement of learning, right? So the coaches can go back and say, hey, this group of people that I've been mentoring or coaching, they've been through this program and I can see a difference in how they're performing or the questions they ask me or don't ask me. We see that. So, but then measuring the coaching and mentoring programs themselves, again, outcomes are part of that. You can still use outcomes to measure how well those programs are working. Are people who have a coach or a mentor, are they doing these things better than people who don't? What's the feedback loop on the mentoring program? Do people, say that this is valuable? I find that the advice or the guidance I'm getting, I'm putting into practice. Those kind of things. So thanks. Let's see. Mentioned utilizing the Kirkpatrick model. What is Brandon Hall Group's view on the ROI Institute's methodology? No, I don't necessarily really have we don't have a specific point of view on that. We can have an offline conversation. I'd love to, if you'd like, on that. I have a particular point of view on ROI in general, not the ROI Institute, but the concept of ROI. But we can talk a little bit more about that offline if you don't mind. Thank you. What methods do you use to measure more informal learning? So we talked a lot about that, how if you're using outcomes, it's all the same. But there are things in informal learning that are unique for measurement. What we found, especially when you're using things like social and collaborative learning, where learners are learning from one another, which is a great way a great thing to do. It's strange to me how many companies shut that down. They hire all these great people and then feel like they're too dumb to talk to one another for some reason. But if we allow people to collaborate and work together, you'll start to see, you can measure that network. You can measure things like who's answering questions, who are people turning to for information, for knowledge. All of a sudden you've got these new measurements that you didn't have before, and you've got insight into your workforce. Like, hey, this person here is a hub of knowledge. We didn't know that. Or these people have these skills and we didn't realize, and they're in this role. Maybe they should think about that role. So there are new things we can measure when it comes to informal learning. But again, the metrics, that's sort of my mantra here, is they're the same regardless of the type of learning. So let's see here. One challenge in measuring business performance improvement is based that the business metric is normally based on multiple variables, right? Yep, we did touch on that. And there's a time delay between training and seeing the metric change. How do you address this? Well, if you have this some sort of framework in place that shows what the process is, like, look, we're aimed at this outcome, and here's how we're going to do it, and we're going to measure at this interval and this interval and this interval. You can demonstrate your performance across that spectrum, right, from point A to point B. Yes, there are other variables, but you can still show, look, we did this and this happened. The big help actually is technology. The more learning platforms that have more robust learning analytics are helping companies really do a lot of this, because they're capturing a lot of data that they weren't capturing before, and being able to import and export and use data from other parts of the business to really tie this stuff together. But yeah, being aware of what the outcome is, being aware of what the time delays are, and being aware of what the other variables are, not just acknowledging that there are other variables, but knowing what they are. Like, okay, look, we know that there's a seasonal change, or we know that the market's doing this, that, or the other, whatever the other variables are, having those in place already, not waiting till the end to find out that there are other variables, but at the very beginning saying, look, we know that there are these other variables and we're going to work with that and around that. But it isn't an exact science, but the idea is being as prepared as possible to come into that conversation as well armed as you can be. So then let's see here. I know we're just at the hour, but I do have another question or two here. So thoughts on effectiveness metrics for new entry-level training program where there's not been a formal entry-level training program before. Okay, well, yeah. So there hasn't been a program before, so hopefully whatever you're doing is going to make things better than there was when there was nothing. You could go back to people who came on board and were onboarded before that program was in place and ask them about their onboarding and compare that to people who are going through a training program and see what the feedback is. You could also see, I think you'd still be able to see, even if it's not a training program, people who didn't have that entry-level training program, there was probably a time to proficiency, right? An amount of time in which it took them to be able to fly on their own. Is that shortened now that you've got this entry-level training? And then whatever the specifics of the training actually are, which I obviously don't know, but do people do those differently, or compared to people who never got that training? But the good news between that is you've got a control group, right? So if it hasn't been used before, you've got a whole group of people in the organization that never had it. So you can use all kinds of things that they do or don't do, or how they think compared to the people who've been through it, and see if there's any correlations. That's just what I would suggest. Sarah gives us a summary I'm going to share. Learning should be about changing the behavior of learners, and one of the successful conditions is having the company leaders involved in deciding what metrics are important. Yes, absolutely. Learning can't do this on its own. You can't just operate in a vacuum. And I know it gets hard. We're doing this stuff every day. You've got a billion things you got to do on a daily basis. It's really hard to lift your head up and sort of do that more strategic, big picture stuff, especially if you're operating in a place where there isn't a CLO or somebody like that who's got that position to work with. But it's important. And so being able to generate that, and the sooner you do that and generate those types of relationships and are able to have those conversations, the easier it is to do on a go forward basis. Just because you've done it, you've started the ball rolling, and then you can start to show the results. You can start to talk to them. Hey, look what I can show you now that you talked about this with me. I can give you better results. I can show you how much better we're doing, and then they get more invested and more involved, and that relationship gets even better and easier. So I think that's all the questions, and we went through, did the whole hour. So I appreciate all of your questions and your feedback and your participation in the polls. It's been great. And like I said, you can reach out to us here at successorplannerhallgroup.com. I've got all your questions and stuff in the platform. So I know I told a couple people I'd reach out to them offline. So I'm going to make sure I do that. And thanks again for joining me. Thank you for SAP Litmos for allowing me this time to talk to you guys. And I hope to see you on another webinar. So thank you, everyone.